In 1995, the final 51 of these birds left on the planet were placed in helicopters and carried to islands where every predator that had ever hunted them had been removed. It can weigh as much as 4 kilograms. It is unable to fly. It gives off a faint smell of wild honey, a scent so recognizable that you can notice it before the bird ever comes into view. And for 60 million years, that mix of features did not hurt it at all. Because for 60 million years, there was nothing on the ground in New Zealand that could sniff it out, run it down, or grab it. Then those same traits nearly cost the species everything. This is the kākāpō, the heaviest living parrot on Earth. And this is what happened after conservationists handed it everything they believed it required to bounce back, only to see the species resist recovery step by step, system by system, as if it could not be ordered back from the edge. It would take 30 years, 2 islands that failed, a genetic bottleneck no one could work around through engineering, a tree whose fruit held a hidden secret, and eventually drones carrying parrot sperm over the forest canopy in the dead of night before anyone truly figured out what this bird needed. The feature that turned into a target. For 60 million years, New Zealand had no land-dwelling mammalian predators. Not a single one. No foxes. No feral cats, no weasels, nothing with 4 feet and a hunter's instinct moving across the forest floor. The kākāpō's only real threat had always come from above. Raptors hunted by vision, dropping from the sky onto anything careless enough to be visible against the canopy. So the species shaped its whole survival plan around one simple reaction: hold still and vanish into the moss. Its feathers developed into a mottled moss-green pattern, so hard to distinguish that it nearly blends into the forest floor it lives on. It gave up flight completely, because in a place without predators on the ground, flying was a costly luxury it had no need for. Its bones became solid and weighty rather than hollow. Its breastbone, the keel that supports the flight muscles in every other parrot species on Earth, dwindled until it was almost gone. In practical terms, it became a 4-kilogram parrot that walked the ground and depended almost entirely on instinct and concealment. For 60 million years, that system succeeded. It succeeded flawlessly. Then people reached the islands of New Zealand around 800 years ago, and in evolutionary terms, the whole calculation changed almost instantly. Humans brought dogs and rats with them. Much later, European settlement brought cats and stoats. These were animals that mainly hunted with their noses, not their eyes. And that is where the kākāpō's flawless protection became a flawless weakness. A bird scented like honey that freezes instead of escaping is not concealed from an animal hunting by smell. It is announcing exactly where it is, then standing motionless to make the hunt easier. Nearly everything that had shielded this species for 60 million years, its smell, its stillness, and its inability to fly, became at almost the same moment the exact mechanism that came close to destroying it. The crash did not happen slowly. By the 1970s, scientists regarded the species as functionally extinct. Years of searching had found almost nothing. Then, in 1974, a search crew discovered 18 survivors hidden in some of the most unreachable valleys still left in the country. The slopes were so steep and the vegetation so thick that predators, for one reason or another, had not yet fully pushed into them. The relief lasted only about as long as it took to inspect the birds carefully. All 18 of them were male. A species can endure almost anything except having its entire remaining population contain no females at all. Eventually, a second and smaller group was found on Stewart Island, just off the country's southern tip. Most importantly, this group did include females, but feral cats were already spreading through the area, and the numbers were unforgiving. With every breeding season the rescuers waited, the population dropped again. There was no time remaining for a cautious, perfectly organized plan. There was no room left for hesitation. They could only move. Island Zero, and the disaster that showed them what it meant to move kākāpō onto islands without predators, was not some fresh concept in 1995. The idea had been tested once already, almost a full century before, and it had gone wrong in the most devastating way possible. In 1894, a naturalist called Richard Henry moved almost 400 kākāpō to Resolution Island, just off the southwest coast of New Zealand's South Island. By nearly every account, It was the first intentional attempt anywhere in the world to create a predator-free island refuge, long before conservation biology had even become an official field. Henry carried the birds across by hand himself, trip after trip, believing he was securing a lasting future for the species. For 6 years, it seemed to work. Then, in 1900, a small number of stoats swam the strait between the mainland and Resolution Island, a stretch of water most planners had believed would serve as a reliable barrier. Within only a few breeding seasons, every one of those 400 birds had vanished. Henry had watched, with his own eyes, the collapse of the only safety net he had managed to build for an entire species. It is still one of the most isolated and painful footnotes in the history of conservation. Yet that failure became the pattern for everything that came afterward. When the last 51 known kākāpō alive on Earth were flown out in 1995, their new homes were selected with the lesson of Resolution Island's failure firmly in mind. The islands had to sit far enough from shore that no predator could realistically swim across, with currents and coastlines that made an accidental stoat arrival far less likely. Every item of gear taken onto those islands was disinfected before it ever touched the soil to prevent rats or disease from being carried in through cargo spaces or on the soles of boots. The quarantine rules were handled as close to absolute as any conservation project could possibly make them. According to every sensible model available at the time, the most difficult stage of the rescue should have been finished. Take away every outside danger, offer plenty of food, remove every known reason the birds were dying. By the thinking of that period, the survivors ought to have bred their way back from the edge of extinction fairly quickly. But that was not what occurred. They were safe, well-fed, and doing almost nothing. From 1980 through 1995, across every documented nesting attempt on the protected islands, just 3 chicks lived long enough to fledge. 3. After 15 years of work, the first problem researchers pointed to was rats. Not the invasive danger that had first wrecked the mainland population, but a lingering one. A rat could not kill an adult kākāpō. The bird was simply too big and too powerful for a rat to bring down directly. But rats could, and repeatedly did, chew through and ruin eggs that had been left unattended in nests, wiping out entire breeding efforts before even one chick could hatch. Conservationists answered by removing rats from the breeding islands completely. It was a huge, costly, and physically draining task, requiring years of trapping, poison operations, and biosecurity work to keep the islands clean. They then surrounded the remaining nests with physical defenses that no predator still present could realistically break through. And after every outside threat had truly been taken away, something even more peculiar began to happen. The birds simply quit nesting. They were not ill. They were not underfed. If anything, the situation was the reverse. They were being fed high-quality supplemental food every day by rangers, weighed on a regular schedule, watched closely, and kept under some of the most carefully managed wildlife conditions anywhere on Earth, yet they still would not pair up. Year after year of complete safety and complete abundance produced almost nothing. It was as if the species had a switch hidden deep inside its biology, one the researchers could not reach, and no amount of protection, food, or careful outside management could touch it. The rangers tested almost every option they had in those days. They changed feeding times, tried new mixes of extra pellets, and even shifted where nest sites were placed, hoping that one small factor might be the thing they were missing. Nothing made any real difference. Year after year, the birds stayed fit, well-fed, and utterly unwilling to breed, almost as though all the carefully built machinery of human conservation meant nothing to them as a reason to reproduce. It would require years of slow, patient, and often maddening research before anyone understood what actually flipped that switch, the tree that governed the bird. When the answer finally came, it proved to be one particular tree species. The rimu is a native conifer that grows slowly, can survive for as long as 500 years, and does not produce fruit reliably every season, like many other trees. Instead, only once every 2 to 6 years, it creates a huge, heavy crop of fruit in what ecologists call a mast year, a rhythm that, until fairly recently, remained strikingly dependable. Eventually, scientists began to see a pattern that looked far too exact to be accidental. Kākāpō nesting on any serious scale occurred only in years when the rimu produced a major fruiting event. In all other years, things essentially stopped, no matter how much human-provided food was waiting in feeding stations around the islands. The explanation forced scientists to rethink an assumption they had accepted for a very long time. The key discovery came from a 2016 study led by nutrition researcher Dr. Pamela von Hurst at Massey University in partnership with the Department of Conservation. Her group found something almost no one had even considered testing. When they analyzed rimu fruit, they discovered unusually high levels of calcium and, more importantly, vitamin D3, a compound researchers had long believed could be made only by animals, produced through sunlight acting on skin or feathers. According to the standard thinking of the time, plants simply did not create vitamin D3. The rimu tree did. That made a special kind of sense once researchers looked closely at the kākāpō itself. This is a night-active, flightless bird of the forest floor, living nearly its whole life under thick canopy, with about as little direct sunlight as any bird on Earth. By normal logic, a species like that should have no dependable way to make its own vitamin D at all, so finding a plant that supplied it straight through the diet felt less like an odd detail and more like the missing part of a formula researchers had not realized they needed. For a female kākāpō who sits on her eggs completely alone for months with no assistance from any mate, in a species where the male's parenting role ends as soon as mating is over, that dose of vitamin D3 works almost like a biological gatekeeper. If she does not have enough of it moving through her body, she cannot produce the calcium required to build a viable eggshell, no matter how much protein-rich artificial food she has been eating. No rimu means no nest, not because of a behavioral preference the birds might be persuaded to ignore, but because of a strict physiological boundary built into the chemistry of reproduction itself. Later, researchers noticed an even more unusual complication. The unripe rimu fruit eaten early in the season seemed to set off the breeding behavior itself, almost like a hormonal signal, telling the birds that the time was right. The ripe fruit that appeared weeks afterward served a completely different purpose, providing the real nutritional package chicks needed after hatching. The tree was not merely feeding the kākāpō, it was scheduling them. In one clean, elegant mechanism, it made sense of 15 years of what had looked like failure. The birds had not been obstinate, they had been exact, the solution that worsened the problem and the technology that came next. In 2002, rimu was truly plentiful on Codfish Island, and after many years, a real chance at recovery finally seemed to appear. The conservation team took what, at that moment, seemed like the most sensible step forward. If the rimu was already helping, why not increase the extra food as well? Give the strongest, healthiest females every possible benefit so they could lay the highest number of eggs. It seemed reasonable that more food would lead to more eggs, and that more eggs would produce more chicks. The chicks did arrive, but when scientists tested their sex, 70% turned out to be male. The population was already dangerously lacking females. It had been that way ever since the first 18 survivors were discovered in 1974, and all of them were males. Now, the very intervention designed to speed up recovery had driven that imbalance even closer to disaster. The reason behind it proved to be evolutionary and almost wickedly elegant. Male kākāpō grow 30 to 40% bigger than females, and they need far more energy to reach full size while still inside the egg. When a mother detects truly rich food supplies around her, her body tilts the chances toward producing the larger, more physically competitive sex. In the wild, where abundance is unusual, that strategy makes sense because a bigger and stronger male has a better chance of spreading his genes. But in a population already desperate for females, it becomes catastrophic. Once researchers worked out the mechanism, the solution was nearly the reverse of what instinct would suggest. They reduced the extra food, not to a level too low for the birds to nest successfully, but carefully below the point that activated the hormone response skewing chicks male. As soon as the rations were adjusted to copy natural wild conditions, instead of artificial plenty, the sex ratio among new chicks moved back to almost balanced. In that single breeding season, the population increased by nearly 40%. The lesson shaped every decision that followed. This species could not just be handed more. It had to receive exactly what it would have encountered in the wild, not extra, not less. Everything had to be calibrated with a level of precision that was almost obsessive. That same precision carried the program into territory nobody in 1995 would have imagined. By the 2000s, another danger had appeared, and it had nothing to do with food or predators: genetics. Since every surviving kākāpō came from such a tiny founding group, geneticists discovered that the entire species traced back to only about 36 separate lineages. The bottleneck was severe enough to endanger long-term fertility by itself. The response, by normal conservation standards, was almost like science fiction. Rangers started collecting semen straight from males and using it to artificially inseminate females when their natural mate choices were not creating the genetic variety the population required. They were pairing birds that never would have matched themselves. The collection process was so difficult that researchers experimented with almost anything that might help, including, at one point, remote-controlled cars disguised to look like female kākāpō, in an effort to trigger natural mating behavior that could then be redirected into the laboratory. Eventually, fertility rates rose into genuinely useful territory. Fertility in second, clutches, increased from about 29% without help to around 70% with assistance. Even getting the sperm to the right place quickly enough became a separate engineering challenge. Kakapos semen loses viability rapidly, and its quality drops measurably within only a few hours. On an island where breeding males and receptive females could be divided by ground that takes 90 minutes to cross on foot, that shrinking window was a serious limitation. The program's answer became one of the strangest innovations in modern wildlife conservation. Drones, the team, jokingly called the sperm copter, carried vials of fresh semen over the forest canopy in just 5 to 8 minutes, far quicker than any ranger could manage while racing through thick bush. Beneath all those figures, certain birds gained personalities and reputations that no spreadsheet could ever show. The most obvious case was Srirako, raised by hand from the chick stage and made famous worldwide in 2009 during a live BBC wildlife broadcast, when he climbed straight onto the head of an ornithologist, presenting on camera, and showed viewers around the world exactly why kākāpō mating behavior is so difficult to control from inside a laboratory. Within days, the clip had spread everywhere online. Instead of treating the moment as humiliating, the Department of Conservation turned Srirako into the official face of the species, the only kākāpō formally approved for regular contact with people, a position he still holds now. Then came the setback that echoed the original number, and the record that at last surpassed it. In 2019, during the same season, when the program achieved a new fledgling record, catastrophe arrived with no warning at all. Aspergillosis, a fungal disease that flourishes in crowded nesting conditions and is much harder for immune systems weakened by decades of inbreeding to resist, swept through the birds on the breeding islands. 21 birds became infected. 9 of them died. Conservation workers had to launch an emergency evacuation, transporting the remaining at-risk birds to mainland veterinary centers for treatment that simply could not be given on the islands. The number taken out was 51. Exactly the same number to which the entire global population had fallen back in 1995, returning decades later as a bleak and completely unintended coincidence. If anyone still needed evidence, it showed that the threat facing this species had never truly gone away. It had only been held in check, kept there by relentless human intervention. The answer was to spread the risk across more places instead of keeping it concentrated on only a few islands. In 2023, in what the Department of Conservation described as a real conservation milestone, 10 kākāpō were released at Sanctuary Mountain, Mongatari. It was the first intentional move toward bringing the species back to mainland New Zealand after about a century, in which it had survived only on offshore islands. The reserve is guarded by a predator-proof fence that runs almost 50 kilometers around the mountain's edge. Among that first small release group, several birds use their strong hooked beaks like climbing equipment and their powerful claws to go directly up and over a 2-meter metal barrier designed specifically so nothing could climb it. Researchers then had to locate the escapees, catch them again, and completely rework parts of the fence. Even after 4 decades of recovery work, the species was still discovering the limits of every structure humans created to hold it. What followed, however, is the part of the story almost no one expected. After the program's previous full breeding season in 2022, which had also set a record at the time, the Rimu trees fell quiet again, as they often do, and the population stabilized, then slipped slightly through natural losses, reaching about 236 known adults going into 2026. Then, after a 4-year stretch without a major breeding season, the Rimu trees across the southern islands produced fruit in volumes the program had never recorded before. 80 nests were made, at least 256 eggs were laid. Within months, 95 chicks had hatched, not merely passing the 2019 record of 73 fledglings, but exceeding it by a huge margin. The Department of Conservation described it plainly as the largest breeding season since the program began 3 decades earlier. Not all of those chicks will live long enough to be counted as fledglings. Some already have not. But the sheer scale already says something those 1995 spreadsheets never could have seen coming. Back in 1995, the founder group had barely 20 females old enough to breed out of 51 birds in total, and nearly all the rest were males. Now, after 30 years of tightly managed nutrition, drone-supported insemination, and careful genetic pairing, that figure has reached 83 breeding-age females, about 4 times the number the species began with. The whole population is now somewhere in the low to mid-200s. Each bird has its own name, is monitored with a smart transmitter, and is weighed again and again by rangers who recognize every individual on the island. Every step forward in this comeback only happened after the species first rejected something. It would not breed just because dangers had been taken away when the biological conditions still were not right. Forsake. It would not nest without rem, regardless of what other food was sitting ready in the feeding stations. When it was given more food than the wild would ever have supplied, it shifted its own chicks toward males. It went straight up and over a fence that had been designed specifically so nothing could climb it. Through almost every phase of a 30-year effort, the kākāpō pushed scientists to give up the idea that protection and supplies by themselves would be enough, and forced them to learn slowly and at real expense what the species truly required. The program's goal now is not just control anymore. It is the intentional, step-by-step easing of the very systems that have been built over 3 decades. A cautious move away from constant management, with the hope that one day the species can breed and survive without human oversight in primary forest again, as it did for 60 million years before any of this help became necessary. So what do you think? If a recovery depends this much on people, even on drones carrying sperm through the forest canopy, can it still be called a real return to the wild? Or is it still something different altogether as long as humans continue managing almost every part of these birds' lives? Tell me what you think in the comments, and subscribe for more stories like this one.